can't see me, you Stevie. Wondering how I reach more evolutions than Evie and make it look easy.
What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Alright, today's video, we're gonna be talking a little bit about Moon Knight number 20 by Jed McKay and Alessandro Cappuccio, but more specifically, I actually want to talk a little bit more about a backup story in this issue by Danny Lore, Ray Anthony Height, and Rochelle Rosenberg. This particular backup story actually has nothing to do really so much with Mark Spector or any of his various personalities, but more the identity of Moon Knight, and even more specific than that, with the character of Blade. We know that Blade was on the horizon for Moon Knight, and he makes his return to Moon Knight's side of things in this issue. However, at first, he's dealing more with the character of Nissi, another of Khonshu's Fist, a Moon Knight no different than Mark Spector, though in her estimation, she's not the right hand of Khonshu in the way that Mark Spector is. But a Fist of Khonshu nonetheless, she is blessed with his power and takes up his charge of protecting those who travel the night, no differently than what Mark Spector does with the Midnight Mission. And this story takes place during 1977, and more specifically, the real-life blackout that happened in 1977 in New York. The neighborhood of Inwood was struck by a blackout that led to events so harrowing that it was even chronicled in Time magazine. The blackout occurred due to a freak lightning strike, and it knocked out power in almost all of New York. All of my New Yorkers watching this video, depending on your age, you probably already know about this event, were around for this event, or in some way, shape, form, or fashion know something about this event. It's something that is widely talked about. And while the events and the aftermath of that blackout are a whole other story altogether, there were a lot of circumstances that surrounded those events, so it's a very loaded thing to talk about. But I will definitely say that while yes, there was a lot of looting and crime that happened during that event, one can't overlook the fact that around the time that happened, New York was suffering probably one of its greatest financial crises ever in the history of the entirety of the city. It was also in the midst of the Summer of Sam murders, and it was also, at the time, one of the biggest heat waves in recorded history. So there was a lot going on that led to the tensions that pretty much caused that entire event, but that's not really what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is the fact that Blade and this Moon Knight that we've never met before by the name of Nissi, they encounter one another, and Nissi initially thinks that Blade is a typical vampire. She doesn't know right off rip that he's a Daywalker, and the reason why they're doing battle with one another is not necessarily because Blade wants to fight her, it's the fact that Nissi wants to kill him because, as I said earlier, she thinks he's just another vampire. She doesn't really know him, but what they're both there for is to try and take down the vampires who are using the blackout of 1977 as a cover to do their typical vampire takeover shenanigans. But why this issue is so important is because Nissi has a specific connection to a character very close to Mark Spector. At least that is my estimation here. Through the course of this backstory, we learn that Blade and Nissi, while they did become allies in their war against all suckheads, at the end of the day, Nissi still had trouble trying to compartmentalize the idea that Blade could in fact be a good person, that he is more than just a vampire. Even after learning that he was a Daywalker, that he actually was someone who vowed to kill all vampires, it was still difficult for her to wrap her head around, because it's kind of implied that she had some level of experience with vampires, having preyed on her own family and friends. Hence, she kind of already had some prejudices in there, and rightfully so. At that time, Daywalkers were a rumor. Blade wasn't supposed to be a thing that exists, so it's easy to empathize with Nissi that while yes, we know Blade's a good guy, it's okay to understand that she wouldn't know that, especially since this was early on in Blade's Marvel Comics publication history, at least as far as when all this takes place. But in the end, Mark Spector is reaching out to Blade by the end of the story to ask for a favor, and that favor is for Blade to help one of Moon Knight's new charges, someone who's been working very closely with him in the Midnight Mission, the character of Reese, a woman who was turned into a vampire in Jed MacKay and Alessandro Cappuccio's Moon Knight #1. This is also a character who Mark has become incredibly close with. This is something I've talked about off and on since, this whole Moon Knight thing began. The fact that Mark and Reese have some kind of unspoken thing, whether it's them being very close allies, being as close as brother and sister could potentially be, or if it goes something deeper than that. What we know is that Mark does have some level of feelings for her, and Reese very likely has something vaguely similar. It's hard to tell sometimes because with the interactions that are going on between not just Mark and Reese, but also with the character of Soldier and Reese, there's some complexity there that is yet to really be fully explored. But whatever the case is, Mark wants to protect Reese. He wants to help her become the best vampire that she can possibly be. And what I mean by best vampire is help Reese in her efforts to not turn into a typical vampiric monster. And that's something that Reese has always been worried about. We've seen this in earlier issues of Moon Knight, where Reese is terrified of the idea that she could potentially hurt someone. And she's even more beat up about the fact that she is technically in an indirect way responsible for Soldier being turned into a vampire, even though technically she didn't do it to him. But when Zodiac shot her, the bullet went through her and then into Soldier himself. And since that bullet had fragments of Reese's blood on it, that bullet, while it did kill Soldier, it turned him into a vampire and technically makes Reese his sire. All that aside, Mark just wants the best for her, and Blade is more than willing to help her. And what strikes Mark as so odd is that Blade doesn't even really ask questions. He doesn't really care who she is, at least he doesn't seem to. He's like, no, sure, I got you. Whatever you need, I'll look after her. I'll help train her so that she can learn to control the thirst and not turn into a monster. And when Moon Knight decides to ask Blade why he's offering to help him so freely and not really seeming to have any hesitation about it, because as Moon Knight and Blade have worked together in the past, Moon Knight knows that Blade isn't the type of guy who just jumps into things willy-nilly unless he has some skin in the game or in some way, shape, form, or fashion is connected to these situations. And while some would probably think, is this because he's related to her? No, I think it actually has more to do with the idea that Nissi is related to Reese. When Mark brings up the idea that he doesn't remember Blade owing him a favor or any of his other personalities a favor, Blade points out that it's not a favor that he owes to Mark or Jake or Stephen Grant. It's a favor that he owes to Nissi, because Nissi took a chance and spared Blade's life. She was originally going to kill him once they had wrapped up killing the vampires who were plaguing the neighborhood of Inwood. And Blade made her a promise. He said that you can kill me if you want to, but then there would be one less person out there fighting the good fight against vampires. But if you let me live, well, for one, that means that there will be one more person out there fighting the good fight alongside you, and that he would owe her a great debt. This is him repaying that debt. I think it's very safe to assume that Reese is in some way related to Nissi. I think whether it's as a daughter, or I would say by this particular point, maybe closer to being a granddaughter of Nissi in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But whatever it is, I think this is awesome, and it's a really cool way to get Blade involved with the shenanigans going on between Moon Knight and Reese. This is actually something I talked about a long time ago. If you go back to some of my earliest videos about Jed MacKay and Alessandro Cappuccio's Moon Knight series, one of the things I brought up was that with Reese being around and Moon Knight, palling around with all these vampires, and the idea that Reese wasn't going anywhere anytime soon and she was struggling with her vampire nature, I said right then and there that I would be shocked if Blade didn't factor into the story in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But anyways, that's everything I wanted to talk about with Moon Knight number 20. There's a lot of other good stuff going on in the main story, and it's all fun stuff. It's all good stuff. Even some callbacks to early Moon Knight comics from back in like the late 80s, early 90s. If you've ever read the old Mark Spector Moon Knight series, which is a really weird and interesting time for the character of Moon Knight. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in here, and a lot of the old faces that Moon Knight used to deal with back in those time frames, they're coming back, and in a roundabout way, kind of Quotey Fingers haunting Moon Knight, and it's fun to check out. I highly recommend, but I really didn't want to talk about that so much as I want to talk about this story, and I'll probably, you know, as things progress, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that have been happening in the main and core issues. But yeah, there's a lot of wild stuff happening with everything going on with Moon Knight. The idea that he's discovered that he can't necessarily be resurrected by Khonshu as many times, as infinitely as he initially believed, and it's starting to make him question whether or not the next time he dies, will it be for permanent. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video, do the YouTube thing, like, share, comment, subscribe, and make sure you hit that notification bell so that way you don't miss any of the videos that I put out. We're trying to hit 100,000 subscribers here on YouTube in 2023, so become one of Earth's mightiest subscribers and help this channel go beyond Omega level. In the meantime, let me know what you thought about Moon Knight number 20. Keep it plus ultra and sound off in the comments.